I'm not kidding. Someone asked me about this evening's special speaker, the Temple Israel confirmant from the 60s and self-professed heretic. Someone asked me, Rabbi, you have a heretic speaking from the temple pulpit? My reply was, Steve Stern may be a heretic, but he's our heretic. And I love the guy. He is quite simply among the most brilliant, underrated, self-deprecating Jewish writers of our time. Steve has piled up an impressive number of literary prizes, including a National Jewish Book Award, prestigious fellowships, and rave reviews. These high holy days are when we're supposed to take a cheshbon hanefesh, an accounting of ourselves, and face who we really are. Or as my own mentor and dean of the American Jewish Archives and my son's namesake, Dr. Jacob Rader Marcus, used to say, be who you are. Unless you're a schmuck, then be someone else. Steve Stern is his own man. And as Sanford Pinsker has written, and I quote, Stern enjoys nothing more than the chance to lose himself in the worlds and pages he creates. Steve is a Memphian from this temple, whom the New York Times calls a prodigiously talented writer from Memphis who arrives unheralded like one of the apparitions in his own story. Literary luminaries, including Susan Sontag, Gordon Lish, Harold Bloom, praise his stories and books. Criminally underrated is how his stories are described at a website connected with Skidmore College in upstate New York, where Professor Steve Stern teaches creative writing. He's in town to sign and read from this book, his latest. I call it his greatest hits with some new magical tales. It's entitled The Book of Mischief. It is in our Temple Judaica shop. I urge you to get a copy on Sunday morning when the shop opens after Shabbos. He may be the only Jewish writer in the world who covers the Pinch in downtown Memphis to the Catskills in New York. A personal word. Steve is one of those souls I connected with immediately when he was here for an extended time in 2003, tending to his dear mother, now of blessed memory. I understood immediately why Rose was unable to discipline him as a child. You see, his wit makes it very hard for even a parent to keep a straight face. When I asked Steve to address his hometown congregation during these high holy days with something inspirational, he said to me on the phone, Micah, you know, I don't do inspirational, but I do dark really well. We compromised on his selection this evening, which he will introduce, but I just need to say, all kidding aside, how proud I am, not only as a friend, but how proud we all should be as members of Temple Israel to be part of a congregation where writers like Steve Stern and Alan Lightman spent their Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur childhoods. These high holy days are, after all, a time for remembering who we've been, to remember that our present lives as Jews will always be uneasy if there is no past to support it. Steve Stern's work is a treasury of our collective Jewish past. Finally, I'm especially happy as I walked in to see that on this Shabbat, his sister Anne and brother-in-law Mark Schoenfeld, nephew Scott, and Scott's wife Lindy are back in Memphis from St. Louis for a happy occasion rather than that first weekend in May when we laid your dear mother Rose to rest in our cemetery. So, to introduce and share tonight's message, It's my pleasure to welcome home in front of the same ark and eternal light that he faced at Poplar and Montgomery before we moved it to this facility in the 70s, the son of Saul and Rose, brother of Anne, one of Memphis's finest writing talents ever, Steve Stern. He just said, I perjured myself in front of my entire congregation.
I'm not worthy. Do you ever think there might be a reason why I'm so criminally neglected? And I keep hearing this over and over again. I think, if I read this, I think, well, maybe, there's actually good reason why nobody reads this guy. So I have never in my life thought or said anything worthy of being expressed from the Bema. I don't know why Mike asked me to do that. So I was trying to think of something relevant that I might have written that would apply to a Shabbat service during the high holidays. And there was absolutely nothing. But I wrote a short piece about Memphis that I'm going to read you for the State Department of all things, because they did a brochure and they asked writers who were associated with particular cities if they would write something for this brochure that they disseminate in various embassies. And I said, well, it might not be flattering. And they said, okay. But because it's the days of awe, I did have an authentic, for me, experience of I think I can call it awe, when I sort of stumbled into this research that I did years ago in the 80s of the old Pinch neighborhood on North Main Street. For me, it was a profound experience, and I have spent most of the rest of my life since then writing stories that have been generated by that experience, for better or worse. So I'll read this short piece, and then I will remove my heretical carcass from the altar. And I should say that these opinions are not necessarily shared by the author. I have this recurring dream that the blighted downtown neighborhood along North Main Street in my hometown of Memphis has been revitalized. There are shops, cafes, theaters, and people living in refurbished apartments above thriving businesses. So vivid is the dream that on the increasingly rare occasions when I visit the city, I return to the old neighborhood called the Pinch to see if the dream has materialized. In truth, there are some signs of renewed life, an operating trolley, a sports bar and grill, but these are mere gestures in the face of an urban desolation that largely obtains. These dreams are so vivid. I actually, think surely, something is materialized. The city of Memphis sits on a famous fault line, and the ground periodically emits rumblings, as if the earth might be trying to disgorge a past it had not entirely digested. As a kid, I was deaf to those noises. My ideal landscape, something like D'Artagnan's Paris, perched atop Tarzan's escarpment, had little to do with the actual situation of Memphis on its cobbled bluff overlooking the Mississippi. That city, according to the ethos of the times, had already raised most edifices that had any claim to history, so that if you looked back, you could see no further than the distance at which you were born. You were doomed to a kind of chronological myopia. Moreover, as a Jew living in a town that declared itself the buckle of the Bible Belt, Memphis boasted more churches than gas stations, I was always aware of my outsider status. On the other hand, the Reformed temple my family belonged to had managed to erase most elements of tradition in an attempt to become virtually invisible. The rabbi wore ecclesiastical robes. The choir sang from a loft appointed in organ pipes. As a consequence, when I came of age, I left the city without sparing it a backward glance, with no heritage to speak of. Behind me, in a future overcast by the shadow of the bomb, I led for a time the life of my generation, medicating myself against the claustrophobia of the moment. And the medication I still depend on. At some point, I began writing stories in which I tried to mitigate the airless atmosphere of the late 20th century with unlikely fantasies. After a decade or so, having run out of options, I returned to where I'd begun, ashamed at having so little to show for my wanderings. Back in the city that had been so conducive to wishing I was someplace else in, I stumbled into a job at a local folklore center. This was not from any love of the subject. I considered folklore a poor relation to literature, but of sheer expediency. The job, which involved the transcription of oral history tapes, had about it a quality of penance that suited me and seems appropriate for Yom Kippur. I think of every day as a sort of Yom Kippur, in fact. Though after a time I discovered to my chagrin that I was having fun. I hate that. The voices on the tapes were those of old parties recalling the heyday of the fabled Beale Street, once the main street of black culture in the Mid-South. They described the raw vitality of the flesh pots and barrel houses, the root doctors, razor toters, diamond-toothed high rollers and roustabouts, the copper-skinned dancers of the dark rapture. They remembered the excursion boat and medicine show bluesmen and the river before the TVA levees, when it would flood every spring. Then the bayous would back up, and the basin of Beale would become a lagoon, across which its citizens would ferry themselves in lantern-hung wooden skiffs, which is true. From the pawn shops to the honky-tonk district, there was a body of water frequently, and they would paddle from one side to the other. As a landscape, I had to admit that this one was more than a match in romance and danger for my spectral Parisian escarpment. And what was peculiarly interesting to me was that there were Jews in it too. For among the black voices were those of the old immigrant merchants and pawnbrokers who had participated wholeheartedly in the life of the street. Unable to keep a lid on my fascination, I was noticed. My boss, realizing that I was local, worked cheap, and was also a Jew, gave me the title of Director of the Ethnic Heritage Project, whose ongoing mission was to research the roots of the Jewish ghetto community in the Pinch. What I found once I'd located it, for I'd never even heard of the place, was a desert of a neighborhood, the only vestiges of its Jewish past being a scrap metal yard owned by 3 consecutive generations of the Blockman family and a ruined brick synagogue whose final incarnation had been a transvestite discotheque. Otherwise, the street was a no-man's land of weed-choked lots, abandoned buildings, a power station, a bridge ramp. But when I began to track down the survivors of that vanished community, all of them advanced in years and living at a suburban remove from North Main Street, something happened. The underground rumblings I had ignored all my life swelled in volume, culminating in a mighty eruption. And the Pinch rose up in all its pungent activity like a lost continent out of the past with its population still intact. That's how it seemed to me. So ready must I have been to receive it. Spellbound by the testimonies of the living witnesses, I was able to make the acquaintance of the dead. These included Reb Dubrovner, the kosher slaughterer, and Avram Pinsker, the salty teacher of Hebrew. Mr. and Mrs. Makovsky, the mom and pop bootleggers, and their flame-bearded colleague Laser, who presented himself at his own arrangement, a hostage to piety, trussed in the leather thongs of his tefillin. He was arraigned on a Friday night and actually donned his tefillin. Well, that wouldn't be on the Friday. Anyway, on the witness stand. There was Mook Taubenblatt, the ward healer, No Legs Charlie Rosenblum, the hot-headed amputee gambler, and the Zoftig widow wolf who taught the greenhorns how to black bottom. There were the Galicianer Hasids in their stiebel above a feed store who from all reports prayed in midair. And the young Talmud Torah scholars who threw catfish in the ritual bath. And on idle hour, the theater at the idle hour, they had amateur nights and they sawed Rosie DeLugich in half. There was a chestnut tree in Market Square Park under which, on summer evenings, when they fled the oven-like heat of their tenements, the entire neighborhood would sleep, while the scholars hopped about in the branches above them as if leaping from dream to dream, which is the case. So hot, the tenements were sweltering. The entire neighborhood would make an alfresco dormitory in the Market Square Park and sleep out there. I wrote a story about a character who actually enters their dreams, and then fiddles with them. The dreams themselves were crammed with figures out of legends the immigrants had brought with them from the old country, along with their featherbeds and samovars, the Dybbuk, the dead soul that took possession of Minnie Klepfich on her wedding night, the succubus Lilith, Adam's wanton first wife, who visited the bedside of the bachelor Sammy Fuchs, the Lamed Vavnik, or hidden saint, Fischl Botwinnik, a half-wit who lived in a shack behind Blockman's junkyard and for whose sake God refrained from destroying the world. I'd heard life defined as a little gleam in time between two eternities, but for me, the pinch was a station of eternity flanked by time. You could enter it and gather up stories like manna, gather them perhaps forever, an ecstatic occupation. But as it happened, the past was a fly-by-night affair. Time quickly began to close ranks, and the pinch to be swallowed up again by the earth, or in the language of enchantment, the grant money began to run out. Disposed as I was to linger, I knew better. Greedily appropriating souvenirs, the tale of Laser Malkin, the peddler, whom the angel of death hauls off to paradise alive, of old Jake Alabaster, the tinsmith, who, following a map given him by a mystical rabbi, journeys into the bowels of Gehenna to retrieve his deceased wife, Sophie the Tongue. I beat it back to my own moment, just as that timeless dimension, think of the Red Sea unparting, was subsumed once again by history. By then, many years had elapsed. I was middle-aged. I'm 97 now. I had published my first few books worth of stories plundered from the pinch, and also apparently outgrown my nearsightedness, because looking back, I could now see a considerable distance. I could see as far as the Spanish explorers butchering Indians on the riverbank during their ruthless journey westward in search of gold. I could see the Irish refugees from the Great Potato Famine dismantling their John boats for the shanties they inhabited around the banks of Catfish Bay. Later on, they would swap the butternut of the Confederacy for the linen robes of the Ku Klux Klan, who harried the recently freed slaves along Smoky Row. I could see the bodies stacked up waiting for burial in Elmwood Cemetery during the plague of the Yellow Jack, from which the city in some ways never recovered. I could see in the near distance the spot where the Jews once settled and moved on, a district later decimated by so-called urban renewal that coincided with the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr., which was effectively the declining city's coup de grace. It was an event that consolidated the curse the Chickasaws had long ago flung at the burgeoning town when they were driven into exile from their native bluffs. But still, my wishful dreams persist, and in them the dead streets are resurrected in a bustling afterlife. The ravaged downtown neighborhoods dense with foot traffic and a lively mercantile carnival. So vital is the scene that I'm drawn back periodically to inspect the waste of North Main, if only to see if the dreams have left some trace, maybe a splinter from that distant collision of time and eternity, or a spark from the nostalgic little trolley that I can try to fan into flame. And the flame might flare up into a conflagration, out of which one might pluck phoenix-like what? Perhaps another story. Shana Tova.